As World War II draws to a close, American soldiers in the Pacific are under heavy enemy fire from the Japanese on top of the infamous Hacksaw Ridge. As the Americans rush to retreat down the cliff, one man stands alone on top of the ridge, committed to non-violence. He doesn't even carry a gun, but he will go on to save lives of more than 75 men that day and become the man who won the Medal of Honor without ever firing a shot. Desmond Doss was born in Lynchburg, Virginia in 1919. His father, William Thomas Doss, was a carpenter and a veteran of World War I. His mother, Bertha, was devoutly religious, and she raised Desmond as a Seventh-day Adventist. Along with his older sister Audrey and younger brother Harold, Desmond attended the Park Avenue Seventh-day Adventist Church School. After he completed the 8th grade, young Desmond left his schooling behind and took a job at a local lumber yard to help the family make ends meet during the Great Depression. Desmond was very involved in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and his faith was incredibly important to him. He wholeheartedly embraced vegetarianism and always strived to live his life in line with his religious convictions, including his strong commitment to nonviolence. Although Desmond's mother was very religious and instilled these values in her children, his father suffered from depression and alcoholism throughout his life, likely a result of what he had experienced fighting in the First Great War. Desmond witnessed the destruction this caused, and it strengthened his commitment to pacifism. After one particularly violent incident between his father and his uncle, in which Desmond ended up having to wrestle a gun out of his father's hands, young Desmond resolved that he would never again lay his hands on a weapon. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Desmond enlisted in the Army. Even though his job as a joiner at a shipyard was important to the war effort and could have exempted him from military service, Desmond knew that he couldn't stay safely at home when his fellow countrymen were risking their lives, including his younger brother Harold, who was serving with the U.S. Navy on board the USS Lindsay. Desmond reported to Fort Jackson in South Carolina for training, where he quickly realized that his faith and his commitment to nonviolence would be seriously tested in the Army. Desmond immediately made it clear to his superiors that he would not kill enemy soldiers or even carry a gun. Because of his religious beliefs, Desmond was considered a conscientious objector, someone who opposes bearing arms and is usually against military service of any kind. Desmond considered himself to be a conscientious cooperator rather than an objector, since he was happy to wear the uniform and serve his country, just not through violence. Desmond had always dreamed of being a doctor, but he now knew that his lack of schooling would never allow him to follow that dream. He thought that being an Army medic would allow him to serve by saving lives rather than taking them. Plus, he felt that it would be an acceptable workaround to his conviction to avoid working on the Sabbath. Seventh-day Adventists observe the Sabbath from Friday evening until Saturday evenings. During that time, they refrain from secular labor and instead use the time to focus on their relationship with God and care for the needs of others. Desmond felt that his healing work as a medic would be acceptable work to do during the Sabbath, but he did not participate in any other work duties on those days, earning him scorn and suspicion from his fellow soldiers and superiors. They resented the fact that he was exempt from some chores, and because he refused to carry a gun, they didn't feel that they could count on him to protect them in battle. His commanding officers considered him a liability and tried to intimidate him, ridicule him, and break him with extra hard work duties. When that didn't work, they tried to have him declared mentally unfit for service and even court-martialed him for refusing a direct order to pick up a gun. He was ostracized, bullied, and beat up by fellow soldiers, and one man even warned him, "When we get to combat, I'll make sure you don't come back alive." Despite the tension and abuse, Desmond held true to his convictions and lived by the golden rule: do to others what you would have them do to you. He refused to give in to the bullying and slowly began to build trust with his fellow soldiers with his unwavering kindness and generosity and his knack for healing blisters on March-weary feet. Before long, Desmond would more than redeem himself in the eyes of his fellow soldiers. 26-year-old Desmond deployed as a medic with the 77th Division of the 307th Infantry in the summer of 1944. First, Desmond served on the islands of Guam and Leyte, where he distinguished himself by bravely and repeatedly running into enemy fire to treat fallen soldiers and carry them to safety. By the time his unit was getting ready to deploy to the front in Okinawa, Desmond had been awarded not just 1 but 2 Bronze Stars with V devices for exceptional valor. By the spring of 1945, the Germans were close to surrendering in Europe, but in the Pacific theater, the Japanese were still fighting to the last man. Desmond and his unit were redeployed to Okinawa, the Japanese's last barrier to an American invasion of their homeland. The Americans were in the midst of a month-long campaign to capture the Maeda Escarpment, a 400-foot sheer rock face that the soldiers had dubbed Hacksaw Ridge. The terrain on the top of the cliff was treacherous, full of caves and holes where the Japanese were dug in and waiting to attack. Time after time, as the Americans tried to take the ridge, they faced what the Japanese called a rain of steel because there was so much shrapnel and bullets flying through the air. After spending weeks treating soldiers caught in this brutal rain of steel, on May 5, 1945, Desmond was the only medic available to go over the top with the infantrymen as they attempted once again to take the ridge. Desmond and his unit used cargo nets to climb the imposing cliff face. Almost as soon as the Americans secured the top of the ridge, the Japanese emerged from their hiding places and launched a fierce counterattack. The Americans quickly retreated, but less than a third of the men made it back to the bottom of the cliff. More than 100 men were left wounded and lying on enemy soil. Desmond was the only man to ignore the order to retreat. Rather than escape down the cliff to safety, Desmond turned around and ran back into enemy fire and directly to the side of an injured soldier. He quickly treated the man's injuries right there in the field under heavy enemy fire and in plain view of the enemy, before dragging the man to the edge of the cliff face and lowering him to safety in a rope sling using a special type of knot that Desmond himself had discovered. Desmond could have stopped there and still been considered a hero, but he knew that saving lives was his calling and he had faith that God would protect him, so he vowed to stay and rescue as many men as he could before he was killed or collapsed from exhaustion. He stayed on top of the ridge for hours, and he ran back into the chaos again and again to treat the injured and drag them to safety. After he lowered each man to safety, he said a little prayer to himself to keep him going. "Lord, please help me get one more." It would appear that the Lord answered his prayer and then some. Early estimates were that he had saved 50 men that day, but military officials argued that it was at least 100, so the official report settled on 75. Whatever the final number was, there's no denying that Desmond Doss was truly a hero that day. And in case anyone had lingering doubts about Desmond's religious convictions being a liability, he did all of this on the Sabbath, his day of rest. Desmond didn't sit back and relax after this. A few days later, he went along on a night raid and was hiding in a shell hole when a Japanese grenade landed at his feet. The explosion sent him flying through the air and his hip and leg were shredded by shrapnel. In the end, 17 pieces of metal were embedded in his body. Even this wasn't enough to take down this hero. Desmond treated his own wounds in the field and waited 5 hours for rescue. When help finally did arrive, they were attacked again as they attempted to escape. The Japanese were known to specifically target medics. When one of his rescuers were wounded, Desmond crawled off of the litter he was being carried on and insisted that the other man take his place. As he attempted to make his way to safety on foot, his arm was shattered by a sniper bullet. Once again, he treated himself in the field, making a splint for himself out of a rifle stock before being dragged himself to safety with one remaining good limb. Because he had been missing for so many hours, Desmond arrived at camp to find out that he had been presumed dead in the battle. The news had even been reported on the front page of his hometown's newspaper, and he had to write a letter to his mother to set things straight. Desmond was evacuated from Okinawa on May 21st, and after receiving treatment for his injuries, he was back in the U.S. by October 1945. On October 12, 1945, just days after returning home, Desmond stood proudly on the lawn of the White House and accepted the prestigious Medal of Honor from President Harry S. Truman in recognition of his incredible bravery in the Battle of Okinawa. Truman told Desmond, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Desmond was humble about his honor, giving the credit to God, whom he believed saved his life many times during the war so that he could keep doing the righteous work he was doing in battle. Desmond's war service may have been over, but his personal battle was just beginning. He recovered from the injuries he received in battle, but his left arm sustained permanent damage. In 1946, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which he had contracted in the Philippines. It took more than 5 years of treatment before he could be released from the hospital in 1951. Although he was considered 90% disabled by the military because he had lost 1 lung and 5 ribs during the course of his treatments, he became 100% disabled in 1976 after an overdose of antibiotics left him completely deaf. But thankfully, he was able to regain his hearing with a cochlear implant in 1988. After the war, Desmond had originally planned to return to his carpentry career, but he quickly realized that his injuries and lingering health issues made it impossible to work. Instead, he focused on his family and his faith, buying a small farm in Georgia where he and his wife Dorothy, whom he had married in 1942 before deploying, raised their son Desmond Jr. Desmond also worked extensively with his church until his death in 2006 at the age of 87. Even after his death, his legend lives on. Countless books and movies have been made about his life, Several schools and highways have been named for him. He's been honored with statues at the National Museum of Patriotism in Georgia and Veterans Memorial Park in Tennessee, and became a heroic example of living your faith for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was even posthumously honored by PETA in 2017 for his lifelong commitment to vegetarianism. Now for more amazing stories like Desmond Doss's, check out Titanic officer who became a hero of 2 world wars, or this other video. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.